All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into what I think is a totally fascinating systems engineering paradox. Look, in any economy, scarcity is just a fundamental reality, right? We have limited resources and basically unlimited human wants. Every society has to figure out how to allocate what it actually has. But what happens when an entire nation decides to bypass the market entirely, to literally eliminate dynamic prices and try to engineer an economy strictly from the top down? Well, we're heading back to the Soviet Union to decode a system that attempted to rewrite the very mechanics of human coordination. And as you'll see, we're going to explore how that turned scarcity from a temporary glitch into a permanent, built-in feature.
So picture this. You're walking into a typical Soviet shop, say back in the 1970s. You're looking for some basic necessities. Maybe you just need some meat for dinner or some winter clothing for the family. You walk up to the display and the price tag, it looks absolutely incredible. It is highly affordable, way cheaper than what you'd pay in a Western market. But there's a massive catch. The shelf itself is completely bare. You're standing there with a pocket full of cash, the state has set this remarkably low price, but the product simply doesn't exist for you to actually buy.
And that brings us to the central question for this explainer. Seriously, how can a massive economic system guarantee low prices and basic access for everyone, yet constantly generate massive waiting lines and empty shelves? The key thing to understand here is that this widespread scarcity wasn't just a string of bad luck. It wasn't a temporary supply chain hiccup or just some poor agricultural harvests. No, this scarcity was actually mathematically built right into the very way the system coordinated production.
Let's get right into Section 1, the empty shelf paradox. Constructive goals versus mathematical impossibility.
Now, right off the bat, it's absolutely vital to recognize the genuinely constructive goal behind all of this. The central planners didn't wake up and set out to create shortages, right? They actually envisioned a highly ambitious system, one that would replace the chaotic unpredictability and the inequality of private profit with planned, stable social priorities. The goal was full employment, where everyone had a job. They wanted to guarantee that absolutely everyone could afford the basics, like housing, food, and clothing. Honestly, it was an unprecedented, monumental attempt to consciously engineer how a society uses its resources for the common good, instead of just leaving it all up to the whims of the market.
Moving on to Section 2, engineering an entire economy, replacing the market with the planning board.
So how do you actually execute a vision that massive? Well, they established a central state planning committee known as Gosplan, and they relied on this really painstaking method called material balances. I want you to imagine the entire nation's economy as this giant physical ledger board. Instead of using money and shifting prices to signal what needs to be produced, the planners used physical units. We're talking tons of steel, miles of fabric, exact numbers of tractors. It was a system where every single arrow of supply strictly depended on another arrow of demand. So if you wanted to produce 10,000 cars, you had to manually, mathematically, balance that output with the exact tons of rubber, steel, glass, and thousands of other components required. Just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of this headache, take a look at this number, 1943. By 1973, central planners were attempting to manually calculate and balance the physical inputs and outputs for almost 2,000 of the economy's most critical items. Just imagine trying to perfectly predict and balance the interwoven supply chains for nearly 2,000 distinct commodities across 11 time zones in the largest country on Earth. And remember, this was all being done by bureaucrats using slide rules and early mainframes, entirely without a dynamic price system to tell them what everyday citizens actually needed or wanted at any given moment.
Which brings us to Section 3, fixed prices, endless queues. The math of excess demand.
Okay, let's break down the math here. In a market economy, if a good is highly desired but in really short supply, what happens? The price naturally rises. That higher price clears out the excess demand and basically acts as a flare signal to producers saying, hey, make more of this. Think about how scalpers can charge massive premiums for sold-out concert tickets. But Soviet prices were fixed administratively by the state, and they were deliberately kept artificially low to ensure affordability. And right there is the mathematical trap. If the price is low, but the supply is strictly capped by the central plan, you absolutely guarantee excess demand. People have the cash, the price is cheap, so naturally everyone wants the item. The end result? The physical queue completely replaces the price tag as the way goods are rationed out. All right, Section 4, quotas, targets, and bottlenecks. Measuring success by gross output. Because they didn't have flexible prices to signal what people actually valued, the system had to rely entirely on top-down administrative commands. And this led directly into what we call the quota trap. See, factory managers were rewarded. They could often double their salaries with bonuses simply for hitting a gross output target. But this incentivized some truly bizarre behavior. Think about it. If your factory's target was measured in tons of metal, you could easily meet your quota by producing excessively heavy, giant nails that were completely useless for actual construction, or massive, heavy chandeliers that literally pulled down ceilings. Quality and usability, they simply didn't matter. Only that measured metric did. Meanwhile, these managers would constantly hoard raw materials just in case their own suppliers failed them. That starved other factories of needed inputs, while everyday consumers were left waiting endlessly for usable household goods. And because Gosplan's physical arrows were so rigidly interdependent, these plans were stretched incredibly taut. A single bottleneck would just cascade through the entire economic system like a row of falling dominoes. Look at this chain reaction. It's wild. Step 1, a steel plant misses its output target. Instantly, step 2, the tractor factory lacks the necessary spare parts. Because the tractors are broken and can't run, we hit step 3, agricultural yields rapidly plummet. And finally, because the farms underproduce, food shortages hit the grocery store shelves in the cities. Without flexible prices, allowing a manager to quickly pivot and buy parts from a different supplier somewhere else, one single broken link paralyzed the entire chain.
Next up is Section 5, Priorities and the Second Economy, how citizens adapted to scarcity.
Faced with these cascading shortages, the state obviously had to prioritize. Heavy industry and the military, they almost always received their resources first. That left consumer goods, cars, and housing chronically underfunded. So when the official plan inevitably failed the public, human ingenuity just naturally took over. A massive second economy emerged. We're talking something that grew to an estimated 10 to 20% of the entire economy by the 1980s. It was powered by these informal networks of personal favors known as BLAT. Basically, you help me get a doctor's appointment, I help you get some meat. Factory managers even started hiring unofficial supply fixers, known as talkachi. These guys would travel all over the country, bartering for missing parts just to keep the production lines running. The system survived not because the central plan was perfect, but because citizens constantly broke the rules to make it work.
Now, check out this staggering statistic, because it really shows the sheer power of incentives. Legally tolerated private household plots on collective farms made up barely 3% of the total agricultural land in the entire country. Just 3%. Yet, because peasants were allowed to sell this specific produce at market prices, they were so highly motivated that these tiny 3% plots produced over a quarter of the nation's total agricultural output. It is just a brilliant, real-world illustration of how powerful proper incentives are compared to top-down administrative quotas. And, it's really important to point out that Soviet leadership wasn't completely blind to this reality. Prominent economists like V. Trapeznikov and Yves Lieberman, they clearly recognized these deep structural flaws. Back in the 1960s, they championed the Kosygin reforms, practically begging for enterprises to focus on profitability and actual sales rather than just gross physical output. But this is the tragedy of the whole system. It was just too entrenched. Ideological rigidity and massive bureaucratic pushback completely blocked these structural changes. The machine was simply too rigid to reform itself.
Which takes us to our final section, Section 6, Lessons in Economic Coordination, Scarcity as an Information Problem. Looking back at this massive historical experiment, the Hungarian economist János Korné coined just a perfect term for it, the economy of shortage. He pointed out that widespread scarcity wasn't a temporary hiccup. It was a completely normal built-in feature of central planning. And this happened because state factories operated under what he called soft budget constraints. Think about it like this. If a factory is highly inefficient, the state is just going to bail it out because bankruptcies literally aren't allowed. Since money is no object and survival is structurally guaranteed, these factories have an infinite, insatiable demand for resources that structurally guarantees there will never, ever be enough materials to go around.
So the big takeaway here, the Soviet system didn't struggle because it lacked engineering talent. They launched satellites into space, they built massive industrial complexes. It failed because providing a diverse array of cars, apartments, and everyday household goods isn't just a production problem. It is a massive information and coordination problem. In a free market, prices are actually highly dense packages of information wrapped up in an incentive. By destroying the price mechanism, the Soviet system essentially blinded itself. It lost the only tool capable of accurately communicating what millions of people actually valued and how much it truly cost to make those things.
we're going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. The central planners possessed incredible resources, powerful computers, and a genuinely constructive goal of providing for absolutely everyone. Yet, no matter how noble the intentions, can any central authority ever truly possess the complex, constantly changing information needed to perfectly engineer an entire economy? The empty shelves of the Soviet era aren't just an interesting history lesson. They're a warning about the sheer limits of human control. They suggest that human desires and the global supply chains that fulfill them might just be too wildly complex for any single planning board to ever truly master. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.